Imad ad-Din Zengi was born into a world of near-continuous warfare. His father, the governor of Aleppo, was killed in battle against the emir of Damascus when he was about 10. He was only a young teen when a massive Frankish army invaded from the west, destroyed one Muslim army after the next, and conquered Jerusalem in 1099, committing atrocity in their path. The Crusaders, as they'd be known, established a powerful state in the Levant, and as Imad ad-Din grew into a young adult, he watched as they expanded their domain, brushing aside the heavily divided Islamic world. But despite the fierce military orders that were created to defend what was now Crusader land, and the imposing ring of fortifications that they had built, the position of the Latins was never certain. It was not long after this that Imad ad-Din Zengi was adopted by a man named Jakermish, who happened to be the Atabeg of Mosul and had a flair for combat himself. In 1104, Zengi followed his new father into battle and witnessed the destruction of a Crusader army near the city of Haran. The Battle of Haran crippled the offensive capability of the county of Edessa, one of the Crusader states. It also instilled in Imad ad-Din that the Latins of the West could be defeated, but in order to ensure victory, a united Islamic response was needed. This concept, by the way, would be at the core of this man's actions for the rest of his life. In the year 1127, Zengi came to power in Mosul, and the next year he brought Aleppo under his control. Within a few years, he had expanded his power base to include Hama and several other cities that lay to his north. However, not all of his campaigns were successful. He was defeated at Damascus, Homs, and Baghdad, but the man was ruthless and never gave up. He attacked with little remorse and had an eye for spotting his enemies' weaknesses. By the late 1130s, he had gained considerable power at the expense of his neighbors, both Muslim and Christian alike. And then, in 1144, he took this to an all-new level. He advanced on the county of Edessa. The Crusader state was a salient that was surrounded on three sides by Muslim territory. The population was relatively small, and after years of military defeats and political infighting, it had almost no offensive capability whatsoever. It was weak, and Zengi knew it. His army marched in and he laid siege to the city of Edessa for a month. Then, on Christmas Eve of 1144, his forces managed to breach the city walls, and a frenzied bloodbath ensued. The Latin defenders were executed, and many of the city's inhabitants were simply massacred. Now, news of the fall of Edessa and subsequently the loss of the county of Edessa spread quickly to Europe. It was a shock to the sense of invulnerability that the Crusader states had previously enjoyed. The response was equally formidable. Pope Eugenius III called for another crusade. It was a man by the name of Bernard of Clairvaux, a Benedictine monk gifted with an awe-inspiring ability for oratory, who took it upon himself to advocate the new pilgrimage far and wide. His words were rousing, spirited, and struck home with peasant and lord alike. This time, not just princes, but kings of Europe would answer the call and bear the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany raised massive armies and began to move towards the Holy Land. Zengi may have united a good portion of the Islamic world and had become powerful. If the Latins had brought holy war during the First Crusade, Imad ad-Din had answered by bringing down a Crusader state. His military response was regarded as being the beginning of a true jihad. If so, this jihad was about to face its first real trial, because now the Second Crusade was bearing down upon it. Conrad III, leading his German contingent and bringing along his nephew, the future Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, departed in May of 1147. They followed a path near the Danube River and arrived in Constantinople on September 10th. But relations between the Germans and the Byzantine were strained at best. Armed conflict would break out on several occasions. of which it should be mentioned that the Byzantine army managed to give the Germans a bloody nose in their engagements. The Emperor Manuel I had reason to fear now that the Crusaders would attack the city. In fact, John Julius Norwich recounted just how delicate the situation really was. Quote, Manuel I Komnenos, who fully understood the nightmare that the First Crusade had caused his grandfather half a century before, had no wish to see it repeated. He undertook to provide food and supplies for the crusading armies, but emphasized that everything would have to be paid for, and, more importantly, all the leaders would be required once again to take an oath of fealty to him. Meanwhile, any faint hopes that he might have entertained about the quality of the new Crusaders were soon dashed. The German army that set off in May of 1147 seemed to have ranged from the religious fanatics to the rabble of footloose ne'er-do-wells and fugitives from justice, attracted as always by the promise of absolution. Hardly had they entered Byzantine territory than they began pillaging, ravaging, raping, and even murdering as the mood took them. And when the army reached Constantinople in mid-September, relations between the Germans and the Greeks could hardly have been worse. End quote. Conrad III, who sensed this growing animosity, not to mention the fact that his troops were beaten by the Byzantine, decided to cross into Asia Minor and not await the French. He didn't make it very far. On October 25, 1147, the Seljuk attacked him near Dorylaeum, just as Bohemond was in the First Crusade. But the German king lacked Bohemond's tactical brilliance. His forces were divided and fell into the trap of a Turkish feigned retreat. The Second Battle of Dorylaeum was a complete and total disaster. Crusader casualties were extreme. By some sources, nearly 90% of Conrad's forces were wiped out. The Byzantine were later blamed for this defeat, as it was rumored that they had been in league with the Seljuk all along. Now, what was left of the German contingent limped its way back to friendly territory where it met up with the French army. The French would do a little better. They were able to repulse a Turkish attack near Ephesus. But John Julius Norwich would explain what happened next. Quote, The Second Crusade had been a fiasco. Conrad, with a few survivors of Dorylaeum, had continued in the company of the French to Ephesus, where he had fallen ill. Manuel I Komnenos sailed down from Constantinople and brought him back to the palace, where he had personally nursed him back to health. Then, in 1148, he had provided ships to carry him to Palestine. The French, meanwhile, had had an agonizing passage through Anatolia. Although Louis had ignored the emperor's warnings to keep to the coast, he persisted in attributing every hostile encounter to Byzantine treachery, and rapidly developed an almost psychopathic resentment against the Greeks. Finally, he had taken ship, leaving his followers to struggle on as best they might. Only around Easter of 1148 had the last remnant of the great host reached Antioch. End quote. Thus, Conrad III and Louis VII decided to leave their respective armies and take ship to the Holy Land. In spring of 1148, Conrad arrived in Acre and Louis in Antioch. But now that they were in the Levant, the real question was what to do next. The French and Germans met up with their Crusader colleagues in Jerusalem in April of 1148. A council of war was later formed near Acre. The plan that they came up with was not to take Edessa, which at this point had been destroyed, but rather go after Damascus. This actually made strategic sense. Edessa would not only be a difficult target to reach, but also would be a very difficult city to defend. Damascus, on the other hand, was closer, would be easier to hold, a much more vibrant city, and then could be used as a base of operation for further military offensive action. But despite the good reasoning, the operation would be ill-fated from the beginning, hampered by poor logistics and tactical planning. What's more, the defenders of the city knew of the incoming force, had already strengthened the defenses, and were resolved to fight. Conrad III, Louis VII, and their respective armies, now accompanied by King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, set out from Tiberias in mid-July. The Crusaders arrived at Damascus on July 23, 1148, and began the attack the next day. They met intense resistance as they attempted to lay siege. Within a mere 5 days of their arrival, the Crusaders had made almost no progress, had sustained considerable casualties. And to complicate the matter even further, a Muslim relief army under the command of a one Nur ad-Din, much more on him in a bit, had arrived on the scene. The Crusaders decided then and there to abandon the entire endeavor. In ignominious defeat, they retreated from Damascus, each king feeling betrayed and resentful of the other. And of course, when in doubt, the Byzantine were also to blame. The Second Crusade was a complete disaster. The jihad that was started with the fall of Edessa had passed its first test. It would now continue to gain determination. Meanwhile, for the Eastern Empire, it was a political disaster. The resentment of the Second Crusade would linger and make it almost impossible for Constantinople to gain allies. But despite the failure of the Second Crusade and the bad blood that it created, this would still be a very vibrant time for the Byzantine. Emerging from a period where the Eastern Empire was on the verge of annihilation, Alexius I Komnenos had set Byzantium on the path to recovery that would later be regarded as the Komnenian Restoration. By the time of Alexius's death in 1118, the government was partially reformed, the Roman army and navy strengthened, and the economy was doing relatively better, though by the end of Alexius's reign, not so much. But lands in the Balkans, islands in the Aegean, and a good portion of western Anatolia were retaken. Alexius had enjoyed a long reign of power that spanned 37 years. His son and his grandson were to enjoy long reigns as well. Thus, in 1118, Alexius was succeeded by his son, John II Komnenos, who was eloquently described by Norwich as, quote, "At the time of his ascension, John Komnenos was a month short of his 30th birthday. Even his admirers admitted that he was physically ill-favored, but they gave him the nickname John the Beautiful. This was not intended ironically. It referred not to his body, but to his soul. Levity he hated, luxury he frowned upon. Today, most of us would find him an insufferable companion, but in 12th century Byzantium, he was loved. First of all, he was no hypocrite. His piety was genuine and his integrity complete. Second, there was a gentle, merciful side to his nature that in his day was rare indeed. He was generous too. No emperor ever dispensed charity with more lavish. Like his father, John Komnenos was a soldier. He too saw the empire as a sacred trust. But whereas Alexius had been largely content to defend it, John saw his duty in more positive terms: to liberate all territory occupied by the infidel and to restore Byzantium to its ancient glory." End quote. John spent most of his life on campaign, but the man was cautious in his military endeavors, never risking a pitched battle unless he absolutely had to. Rather, he systematically, methodically laid siege and took one enemy strong point after another. He built on his father's success, holding or advancing the borders of his empire. In the west, like his father, he had to contend with another Pecheneg invasion. At the Battle of Beroia in 1122, his forces encountered a Pecheneg army that had assembled an imposing defensive position. A fort of encircled wagons, protected by a ditch, had been assembled. John's initial assaults were repulsed with significant casualties, and the emperor himself was wounded in the leg by an arrow. However, he attacked again, but this time brought in his elite Varangian guard. They used their famed Danish battle axes to literally hack their way through the wagons. Once the Pecheneg line was breached, the imperial army exploited it. On that day, John's forces inflicted so many casualties that the Pechenegs would never again be an independent nation. Instead, they would be incorporated into the Eastern Roman army, making it even more powerful. The Balkans were thus relatively secured, but to further protect his western lands and to offset a potential rival, John sent financial subsidiaries to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was then engaged in fighting the newly crowned Roger II of Sicily. His rise to power just happened to threaten Byzantine interests, and the emperor just seemed to have the bandwidth to get politically invasive. But it would be in the east where John's destiny really resided. Whereas his father had taken the western coast of Asia Minor, John expanded imperial lands into the interior by exploiting the disunited Seljuk. He built fortresses and training facilities for his expanding army as he went. The emperor also sent his troops along the southern coast of Anatolia, securing lands into Cilicia and establishing a land route to the Crusader states. But then, in 1142, he prepared for the greatest campaign of his life, to invade Syria. He deployed his well-trained army towards Antioch. Though at the time it was in Crusader hands, John reasoned the city had always been Byzantine property. However, on the eve of initiating this campaign, John was wounded by scraping against an arrow laced with poison that spread quickly into his bloodstream. Some historians don't consider this an accident, but rather an assassination. But either way, he wouldn't survive. John Julius Norwich gives his final days, quote, "On April 5, 1143, the dying emperor called a council to announce his successor. Both his sons, he said, were fine young men. Isaac, however, was prone to anger, while Manuel possessed a gentleness which enabled him to listen carefully to advice. It was therefore Manuel, the youngest of his children, who should succeed him. Turning to his son, he took the imperial diadem and lowered it on the young man's head, then draped the purple robe across his shoulders. He lived on for 3 more days. His death on April 8, 1143, was pious, efficient, and well-ordered, like his life. Had he been granted just a few more years, he would surely have extended Byzantine power deep into Syria, and might indeed have gone a long way towards undoing the damage sustained at Manzikert. Dying as he did at only 53, he was obliged to leave his work unfinished, yet he could take comfort in the knowledge that his son, Manuel, would prove a worthy successor." End quote. Manuel I Komnenos would reign like his grandfather Alexius for 37 years. He was a tall man, regarded as being handsome, charming, and a bit of a hedonist. In direct contrast to his father, he loved pleasure and the pursuit of, well, more pleasure. But he was also extremely intelligent, cultivated, and had a passion for debate. Plus, he was renowned as being an astute diplomat. Indeed, it was under his reign that the Second Crusade barreled its way through. However, he found himself in a difficult situation in that he also had an adoration of Western European culture. To the absolute disdain of his own people, he reached out to the Roman Catholic Church for reconciliation. He would host jousting tournaments and would incorporate aspects of Western attire. But even worse, he was perceived as showing favoritism to Westerners that resided in Constantinople, especially the Venetians. Whereas his predecessors attempted to limit the population of the Western Europeans in the great city, he appeared to embrace them. It should be emphasized that their numbers, again a big percentage of them being Venetians, grew considerably under Manuel's reign. But mark my words, this bred an intense hatred in the Eastern Romans. Despite this, Manuel continued his father's policy to expand the empire. He deployed his troops west into the Balkans. Near the river Sava in 1167, a Byzantine force took on a Hungarian army in what would later be known as the Battle of Sirmium. Initially, the Romans began to lose ground. But then the imperial heavy cavalry rallied the sagging Byzantine formation and brought their heavy maces to bear. They won the day by smashing the Hungarians into submission, both figuratively and literally. Indeed, the king of Hungary had to sue for peace and became a vassal, thus extending Byzantine control to the Western Balkans. Manuel would also be involved in campaigns to fight Roger II of Sicily, and at one point established an alliance with the King of Jerusalem to invade Fatimid Egypt, though in the end this didn't amount to much. Now that all said about the West, the Emperor would soon have his hands full in the East. Renaud of Châtillon was the son of a minor nobleman who had joined the Second Crusade and decided to stay in the Levant. According to some, the man really couldn't go back. He was a fierce warrior, a ruthless opportunist, and according to some accounts harbored a somewhat malevolent spirit. In 1153, he seized an opportunity and married his way into becoming the Prince of Antioch. From that point onward, Renaud would make a name for himself as being a very dangerous man. What can I say, the man just had this ability to really tick people off. He invaded Byzantine Cyprus in 1156 and unleashed what Norwich would describe as an orgy of devastation and desecration such as the island had never before known. Thus, it was not surprising that when Manuel marched his army against Renaud, the emperor had vengeance in his heart. Upon seeing this humongous force that was bringing the thunder down with him, Renaud did what any man of action would do. He shaved his head, dressed himself in sackcloth, groveled at the emperor's feet, and begged for forgiveness. Surprisingly, Manuel accepted the apology with the condition that Antioch would now be his vassal, there would once again be a Greek patriarch, and that the great city would be garrisoned with Byzantine troops. It was a deal that Renaud couldn't refuse. And so on Easter Sunday, April 12, 1159, Manuel triumphantly entered Antioch as its de facto ruler. The story with Renaud would not end here. But for the emperor, his attention would soon be drawn to a new enemy. After Antioch, Cilicia, and most of the southern coast of Asia Minor were secured, the emperor then sent his men against their longtime rival, the Seljuk, just as his forefathers had done. But in 1176, as the imperial army was moving through a narrow mountain pass, it was ambushed at what would be known as the Battle of Myrocephalon. While it was a significant defeat, it didn't cripple the Roman army. Manuel would rally his forces and the next year would win at the Battle of Hylian, effectively keeping the Seljuk at bay. Thus, Manuel I Komnenos would rule over the Byzantine Empire at the height of its expansion during the Komnenian Restoration. He came the closest to soothing ties with the Western Church, the Crusader states, and the powers of Western Europe. Indeed, his reign saw the contenders of the Eastern Roman Empire held in check either diplomatically or militarily, and all this while Constantinople and her people flourished. But this golden age was not to persist, and what's more, this moment in the sun for the Byzantine Empire would again be its very last. Now, while the official end date of the Komnenian Restoration is 1185, for all intents and purposes it really ended with the death of Manuel I in 1180. His son, Alexius II, was too young to rule. He and his regent would soon be overthrown in a coup. In his place, the despotic Andronicus I Komnenos would come to power and would prove to be an exceptionally poor ruler. The Eastern Empire would fragment and fall into the depths of an extremely dark time, but more on that in a bit. Meanwhile, to the south in Syria, the Jihad started with the fall of Edessa and perpetuated with the failure of the Second Crusade, would lay the foundation of a new empire that would take the Middle East by storm. The fall of Edessa in 1144 was the crowning achievement of Imad Zengi, but he was not to enjoy it for long. Nearly 2 years later, in 1146, the Sultan was killed by one of his own servants. Imad Zengi was then succeeded by his second son, Nur-ad-Din, who came to power in Aleppo while his brother took Mosul. Nur-ad-Din inherited the momentum that his father had started, and would carry it to an all-new level. Hostilities with the Crusader states at this time was becoming intense, but Nur ad-Din proved that he was truly his father's son, a warrior incarnate, and some would argue that he was even more ruthless. In the same year that he came to power, he defeated a Crusader attempt to retake Edessa. In reprisal to those who supported the Crusaders in this attempt, he destroyed the city's fortifications, slaughtered the local Armenian Christians, and sold much of the population into slavery, rendering Edessa a mere shadow of its former status. When the Second Crusade failed at the walls of Damascus, it was truly Nur ad-Din's chance to prove his dedication to the jihad. On June 29, 1149, he destroyed the army of Antioch at the Battle of Imad. His forces managed to kill their prince, Raymond of Antioch, and Nur ad-Din sent his head as a trophy back to the caliph in Baghdad. This victory over the infidel made Nur ad-Din the embodiment of holy war to his people. Many flocked to his banner, his army and his prestige grew, and thus he rapidly was able to expand his domain. Mosul would soon come under his control, and in 1154, Damascus was taken when its weak leader was overthrown. When the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos asserted his control over Antioch in 1159, Nur ad-Din masterfully made an alliance with the Eastern Romans against the Seljuk. This effectively secured the Sultan's northern border with the Byzantine and gave him the initiative to expand his lands further. Nur ad-Din went to work. His primary focus was to secure his hold over Syria. But far to the south, the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt was falling apart under extremely unstable leadership. This, of course, would come to the attention of King Amalric of Jerusalem, who sensed an opportunity. And so, in 1163, the king sent in his army to secure the Nile Delta. As a result, the Fatimids would become even more divided into rival factions, of which one faction invited Nur ad-Din to come in and help them against their rivals, in exchange for about a third of the annual revenue. So in the very same year that the Crusaders had invaded Egypt, 1163, Nur ad-Din sent in one of his best Kurdish generals. The man's name was Asad ad-Din Shurka bin Shadi, but better known as Shurka. For the next 6 years, in a series of campaigns, Shurka fought relentlessly to advance his master Nur ad-Din's interests in Egypt. In a tumultuous maelstrom of battles, skirmishes, backstabbing, and rapidly shifting Fatimid political alliances, Shurka emerged the victor. In January of 1169, he marched into Cairo, became the vizier, and executed all of his opposition. Though technically still under Nur ad-Din, Shurka was now the sole ruler of Egypt, one of the wealthiest of lands in the medieval age. He now had immense wealth, had ascended to a position of great power, and had an impressive army under his control. But then, 2 months later, he, died. As fate would have it, it would be his humble nephew, who had followed him through the rigors of the Egyptian campaign, that would succeed him as vizier. This man's name was Al-Nasir Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he would be known to history by another name. This man would be known as Saladin.